1 Corinthians chapter 13. Would you turn there, please? 1 Corinthians chapter 13. I can think of no better scripture to read this morning, and no scriptures that would be more appropriate on love your neighbor Sunday than this. And Valentine's Day was Tuesday. Most of my life I thought it was on the 15th. Of course, that's my birthday. I just figured, well, it's February the 15th is Valentine's Day. But I only missed it by one day. That's pretty close. Of course, that's the story of my life. A day late and $1 short. 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have not love, I'm become as sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could remove mountains and have not love, I'm nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned and have not love, it profiteth me nothing. Love suffers long and is kind. Love envieth not. Love vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up, does not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil, rejoices not in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. But whether there be prophecies, they shall fail. Whether there be tongues, they shall cease. Whether there be knowledge, it shall vanish away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part, but when that which is perfect is come, then that which is in part shall be done away. When I was a child, I spake as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. For now we see through a glass darkly, but then, or dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know even as also I'm known. And now abideth faith, hope, charity, or love. These three, but the greatest of these is love. This morning, as we come with our burdens, burdened down with really the barnacles of sin and shame and sorrow, I wanted to sail into God's harbor, and that harbor of grace and love and goodness and mercy, and let God work on us and rid us of those things that so easily beset us. And I like to think of this 13th chapter of the book of 1 Corinthians as that harbor where you and I can sail into and experience the wonderful grace and love of God, and let Him work on us and minister to us in these moments that we have together this morning. We need to kind of build a foundation, kind of get the story, the picture of it all, if we're going to understand the topic this morning. And that topic is how love behaves. How love behaves. We used to tell our kids, now, I want you to behave. How love behaves. First and 2 Corinthians, we need to understand a little bit about that and kind of get an idea of what Paul is talking about. He's written these letters to the church at Corinth, and we're going to have to understand a little bit about that church, a little bit about the folks in that church, and when we do that, we're going to see some of us in that church. Some of you, some of me. The city of Corinth is located south of Athens, and that's not Athens, Georgia now. On the peninsula that thrusts itself out into the Aegean Sea. It's strategically located commercially because it has harbors into two seas. It's a stopping point for those from the Middle East, and then those coming from Italy and Spain to the west. It was destroyed as an ancient city, but really was rebuilt in BC 46 by Julius Caesar. But by the time of the Apostle Paul, Corinth really had a higher standing, had more clout than even Athens itself, because the Corinthians considered themselves to be really the sophisticated people, the learned people of that day. It was really a place of commerce, a place of wealth, learned people of that day. But it was also a city of sin and paganism, and a seaport city. It attracted the people from the Mediterranean and the sailors and the businessmen from all over the Roman Empire. They came to Corinth. Now, the center of Corinth, there was a 600-year-old temple of Apollo. But really, Corinth was better known for its worship of Aphrodite, the goddess of love, whose temple was built there on the Acrocorinth. That really is really a monolith, a huge rock overlooking that city. And it was there that thousands of temple prostitutes served in their obscene and sinful worship activities. Corinth was called the Sin City of the Mediterranean. Today, you could call just about any large city in America Sin City. And the Apostle Paul came to that city through Macedonia, and when he there in Corinth, he worshipped in their synagogue, and Paul established a large church, a great church in that city. But it was a church full of problems. It had all kinds of problems and difficulties. And in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Paul tries to deal with the problems in the lives of the people and in the life of that church. Because you see, the people at Corinth and in the church at Corinth had come out of raw paganism and gross immorality, didn't have any Christian background. And they had a hard time accepting the teachings of how a Christian ought to live. And Paul deals with this in 1 Corinthians. Now, in chapter 1, he talks about the factions in that church, the divisions. The church of that day, they had no unifying experience of everybody coming together like we do in one place, at one building, and worshiping together every week. They didn't have a church building. As a matter of fact, it was 200 years on down the road that church buildings came into existence. And the church divided themselves into house churches. Paul writes about the church in your house, the church in this place, the church in that place, the church in another place. And as a result, the church was fragmented and divided and really had some difficulties. Kind of like the best example I guess I could give you would be if you took your Sunday school and just put classes all over this county, this place and that place and the other place. And some people, they have house churches now even. But this created real problems with the church of that day because it created divisions. One would say, I'm following this teacher, I'm following Apollos. Another would say, I'm following Peter. Another would say, Paul, the Apostle Paul, is the true teacher, so I'm going to follow him. So they divided themselves up in factions into that church. And then not only were they divided doctrinally, they were divided racially. They had the Greeks and they had the Gentiles and the Jews, and they were divided in the rich and the poor and the learned, unlearned, and the barbarians who knew very little. And they were just split in all kinds of ways. In another chapter, we read about lawsuits among the membership. And then we read in chapter 11 that the women were creating problems and bringing criticisms on the church by cutting their hair and by coming to church with their head uncovered and going down about the streets with their arms uncovered and appearing in different styles of dress that was unbecoming to modest women of that day. And you see, they had a double standard in that day. The men were free to have their concubines and live their loose, carry on their loose activities, but the women were restricted. They were supposed to stay at home and be chaste and be virtuous and dress modestly and because they didn't want to look like the prostitutes of the temple there on the hill and who were very immoral, and they were not to speak in public meetings and so forth and so on. But when they became a Christian, they were taught some different things. They were taught that in Christ there is no male or female, there is no Greek or Jew or poor or rich. We're all alike. And the women found a new freedom, a new self-esteem, and they spoke up in the worship services, and they cut their hair. And as a result, people passing by and seeing them in these meetings thought that there was immorality in the church, as they would see in that temple up on the Acrocorinth or up on that hill. And the women were bringing criticism on the church by the way they conducted themselves. Now, sometimes I think we greatly misuse that. The principle is this, though, that we should not conduct ourselves in the church in any way that would bring criticism on the church from the outside. Today, women have rights and freedoms, and they are acknowledged to have competence and worth and serving in places of leadership. And sometimes today, even as in that day, we forget about the cultural context of Paul's writings here, and we run off in all kinds of tangents. So we need, as Paul, we need to deal with these problems, not only this, but other problems in a very practical way. And Paul talks about spiritual gifts, and the Greeks thought that everybody had a gift, and today we just say, I think everybody ought to do their own thing, and that plays havoc with the group. One says, I'm prophesying. Another says, I'm speaking in tongues. And they couldn't get any order in their worship service, and it was utter chaos in the church at Corinth. So Paul gathers all of these things in his arms from chapter 1 through chapter 12. And we need to do as Paul, and we need to gather these things. We need to gather it as Paul did. And then he says in the last verse of chapter 12, having said all of this to you now, I want to show you the more excellent way, he says. I want to give you the key that will cover every problem, solve every difficulty that you have. I want to show you the one way. I want to show you the key. I want to show you the one secret, the one word that will solve every problem that we have. And he says, that word is love. He says, listen to what I say. And he says, the primacy of love, that's first. And then he says, the practice of love. Three things that Paul brings out here, and he says it'll solve every problem. It'll make every church the church that it ought to be. It'll make you a Christian that you ought to be, a Christian that can truly show the love of Christ to the folks that you meet and help you live in a way that will bring honor and glory to Christ. It'll solve every one of the questions and every one of the problems on how to conduct yourself and how to act. And if you'll read this chapter 13, 1 Corinthians, every day for at least 2 weeks, I'll guarantee you God will change you through the reading of that chapter and help you live a more productive Christian life. It'll make you a better Christian. So let's see what Paul is really saying to us here. First of all, he says, the primacy of love. Paul paints a picture. Really, it's like he's painting a superhuman person, a superman. He said, I speak with the tongues of angels. Eloquence. A great orator. You turn it around. Though I could speak, though I could communicate, though I had the charisma of, say, Jack Kennedy was someone like that. I can think of some others. And not only that, he said, I have the gift of prophecy. If I had the gift to proclaim the truth of God, even greater than Isaiah proclaimed it, boy, that would be a gift. What a gift that is. More than that, if I had understanding, if I had the knowledge of Socrates, the philosophy, the knowledge, the learning, and if I had the faith to move mountains. Even Elijah couldn't move mountains. Elijah could call down fire from heaven, but Elijah couldn't move mountains. I could move mountains. Faith enough to move a mountain. Though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, not just give some of my money away, give all the money that I have away to feed the poor, selflessly. I'll give it all away. And though I give my body to be burned, though I become a martyr. Boy, this is a super person, isn't it? Paul builds the house. He builds block by block by block. And then all of a sudden, he just, with one swoop of his hands, his arms, he knocks it all down. And it profiteth me nothing if I don't have love. If I don't have love. If it's not undergirded with love, all these things, no good. The greatest gift in all of the world, Paul is saying, is nothing unless it's backed by love. You can buy your wife the most expensive ring you can find in the world. But if you don't love her, it's really nothing. You can pour yourself out in the service of God, in the service of this church. And if you begrudge what you're doing, if you look at it as a chore, if it's not undergirded with love, then really it's nothing. If I preach with the most eloquent phrases and the greatest skill and the greatest resources of knowledge that I possibly could have, and I preach a wonderful, great sermon, and you come through the door and you say, what a great sermon, but then you whisper to someone else, boy, that's a bitter man. That's a bitter person. That person is mad with the world. That person, he doesn't love anybody. He's got problems. You see how he skins the people. You see how he beats up the people. How he condemns everybody. He doesn't have any love. Paul says, if love is not there, then it's nothing. Absolutely nothing. And then he moves on. He says, how can I determine, don't miss this, how can I determine if I truly have love in my heart? And that's a good question, and we need to ask ourselves that. Here is how love behaves. Here is how love behaves. Verse 4 through 7 really is a yardstick that we ought to measure ourselves with every day that we live. And it'll make a better Christian out of you and a better person. How does love behave? Verses 4 through 7. Love suffers long. Paul says love is patient. Love will make you patient with folks. Make you patient with your wife, your husband, your children, other people. Don't say, oh, my nerve, preacher. Paul, don't talk to me about patience because my nerves are always on edge. How can you expect me to be patient? And Paul says, I expect you to cultivate patience. He says, tribulation worketh patience. And God puts things in your life so that you can cultivate the patience that you don't have, but He wants you to have. Because that's love. Love suffereth long. Love is kind. Kindness is an expression of love. Love envieth not. No greater cloud can come over a church, an individual, or a family and a marriage than envy. Oh, you love him more than you love me. You love that more than you love this. And you begin to envy and envy. You can destroy a relationship. You can destroy the fellowship in a church. You can destroy a home with jealousy, envy. But love won't let that happen. Love won't let that happen because love envieth not. You rejoice when somebody maybe is getting the attention, when somebody is advancing, somebody is doing good, is recognized. Love is not puffed up. That Greek word means bellows, puffing and blowing hot air. He's full of hot air, always talking about how good he is and how good what he does and this, that, and the other. Seeketh not her own. Love is not selfish. Not my rights. Not what I deserve. Not what I want. But I'd rather that you get the praise and the glory. Not easily provoked. That Greek word means blowing up. You say, well, I can't help it. I just have a short fuse and I just have to clear me off of space every once in a while and have a fit. Well, you do that. And when you do, usually you're going to hurt somebody. You're going to hurt somebody. Love doesn't do that. Seeketh not her own, and beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. Boy, this is a measurement, isn't it? Paul said, this is how you know that you have love. This is your measuring rod. This is how love behaves, folks. That's getting right down to where we live. This is how love behaves. We must work on every one of these points every day. And Paul then tells us what will happen. But first, let me give you a real practical application of this truth, really from the Bible. You remember over in Luke, the 10th chapter, I think it is, where the Good Samaritan, here this old boy, he goes over there, he's on the way, and really there's about 4 people involved in this story. There's the robber who created the problem, and there's the priest and the Levite who ignored the problem, and the innkeeper who treats it professionally, and then there's the Good Samaritan who solves it. And then the question is asked, who is the good neighbor? Well, a neighbor is different things to different people. Have you ever noticed that? Whereas it was to these folks. Here the traveler from Jerusalem to Jericho in the parable of the Good Samaritan was 4 different things to 4 different people. To the robber, he was a victim to be exploited. To the priest and to the Levite, he was a nuisance to be avoided. To the innkeeper, he was a business proposition, and to the Good Samaritan, he was a good neighbor to be helped. And when you see somebody, love, listen to me, when you see somebody in need, love don't say, I've done enough for him. Love rather says, have I done everything that's needed, and have I done everything that this situation calls for? That's what love says. How far can I go in my helpfulness? Practical application of what Paul is talking about, biblical application. Look at the example of the Good Samaritan if you want an example. He used his skill. He took the trouble to do it. He took his time. He risked his life. He exercised thought and forethought on that sick man's behalf. And when he left that traveler, he left him in good hands. He paid all the expenses. But there wasn't any extravagance now. He gave what he thought was necessary, but promised, now, if any more is needed, when I come back through here, I'll take care of it. The Samaritan was not doing good to relieve a guilty conscience. His only thought was to help the traveler and to help him all that he could. And I've asked myself, where do I fit in that picture? How is love behaving in my life? I say that I love people and I love God. But then, the permanence of love, when everything else is gone, Paul says, now, this is what happens when you live this way. This is what will prevail when you live this way. Love never fails. Love never fails. Paul says these other things will cease. They won't be operative anymore. They'll pass away. Even the knowledge that you gather that you think is so important right now, how soon it'll pass away as far as being vital and relevant. But in verse 13 of chapter 13, he says, now abideth. These things are permanent. They'll stay here. The bottom line, what's left when you get through with it all, the bottom line when you draw the line, three things: faith, hope, and love. No need to talk about faith, because faith is what carries us through. It persists and it prevails. It's the one thing that we hold on to. It gets us through. But then, secondly, there's hope. Our expectations, the fulfillment of our faith, Paul says that remains. But also, he says, love remains. Even greater than faith and hope. The greatest of these is love. Love will cause you to look beyond others' faults and see their needs. Love will make you patient with them and realize that God hasn't finished with them yet. Love will cause you to attack the problem rather than the person. Cause you to reach out and help. And that's what Paul says we ought to do. Love one another. Love everybody. Let them see Jesus in your life and in my life.